Hello and welcome to Your Favourite Teacher. Today we're going to have a look at the plot for Willy Russell's Blood Brothers. Act 1. The opening of the play is a prologue spoken by a narrator. It is almost Shakespearean in the way it gives away the tragic end of the protagonists, reminiscent of another love story, Romeo and Juliet. The narrator informs the audience that the two bodies on the stage are those of twin brothers who were separated at birth. He draws us into the play by asking us to reflect on their mother and whether she is so cruel for her role in their deaths. We then go back in time, some 20 years or so, where Mrs. Johnston is introduced as a struggling, lower-class housewife, abandoned by her husband, with 5 children and twins on the way. She works as a cleaner for a wealthy woman named Mrs. Lyons. When Mrs. Lyons sees that Mrs. Johnston is struggling with her financial and family situation, she comes up with a rather shocking solution. Mrs. Lyons is desperate to have her own child, but it is suggested that she cannot have children. She persuades Mrs. Johnston to adopt one of the babies as long as Mrs. Johnston never speaks of the matter. Soon after the birth of the twins, Mrs. Lyons takes Edward, but Mrs. Johnston immediately regrets her decision. She tells her family that one of the twins has died. When Mrs. Johnston returns to her cleaning job, Mrs. Lyons is uncomfortable with the attention that Mrs. Johnston gives to Edward. She decides to fire Mrs. Johnston, and when Mrs. Johnston tries to take Edward with her, Mrs. Lyons is extremely devious and manipulative. She convinces Mrs. Johnston that twins which are separated at birth and are then reunited will automatically die. Mrs. Johnston is given £50 as a severance pay, or perhaps as a bribe. She then leaves, and the narrator warns that the devil will catch up with them for their immoral deeds. The play then jumps forward in time, and Mickey is introduced at the age of 7. He idolises his older brother Sammy and enjoys playing street games with other neighbourhood children, mostly involving gunfighting. He is warned by his mother, Mrs. Johnstone, not to play near the wealthy houses nearby. Edward arrives while Mickey is moodily sulking and starts a conversation with him. They very quickly become great friends and are delighted that they share the same birthday. They don't have an inkling that they are actually related and go through an elaborate ritual to become blood brothers. The two boys constantly try to play together, much to their mother's dismay. They are both told that they must not play with each other, but the boys quickly forget these instructions. Mickey and his neighbour and friend Linda go over to Edward's house and he escapes and comes out to play with them. They amuse themselves rather aimlessly and end up throwing rocks at house windows. Their game is quickly interrupted by a police officer who marches them home. The police officer is rather abrupt and threatening with Mrs. Johnston, as her children are rather righteous and delinquent. He gives her a final warning that if any of the children get into any further trouble, she is very likely to be taken to court and she might lose custody of her children. The police officer's attitude towards Mrs. Lyons is quite different. He speaks in a respectful tone and downplays the situation by presenting it as a childish prank. Mrs. Lyons convinces her husband that they need to move away to the countryside in order to get Edward away from Mickey, his friends and family. They end up in a large house on the outskirts of the town of Skelmersdale. Act 2. 7 years later, the twins are 14 years old and attending secondary school. Mrs. Johnston is far happier with the family situation as they have been moved to a new council house in the countryside in the town of Skelmersdale. Sammy still gets into a fair bit of trouble at school and with the police. Mickey and Linda are often seen together and definitely fancy each other, though Mickey is excruciatingly shy and awkward and cannot verbalise his feelings for her. Mickey is suspended from school, which is a secondary modern, after an episode of rudeness to his teacher about the purpose of his studies. Similarly, Edward also gets suspended from his private boarding school as he refuses to remove the locket given to him by Mrs. Johnston as a memento. Mrs. Lyons is very concerned and uncomfortable when she discovers this. Mickey and Edward see each other from afar without recognising each other and wish they could be like each other. They eventually do recognise each other and once again return to their old, close friendship, this time with the blessing of Mrs. Johnston. Mrs. Lyons quickly confronts Mrs. Johnston, accusing her of trying to steal Edward's affection. She even tries to attack Mrs. Johnston with a kitchen knife, but is stopped. She leaves the house calling Mrs. Johnston a witch. And so begins an extended and relatively carefree period of teenage larks, scrapes and escapades, with Mickey and Edward being joined by Linda as a trio of best friends. Eventually, though, Mickey needs to start work, and he finds employment in the local factory with the rather monotonous job of making cardboard boxes. Edward leaves for university, only informing Mickey and Linda the night before so as not to spoil their time together. Edward is secretly in love with Linda, but in a gesture of self-sacrifice and brotherly love, he encourages Mickey to ask Linda out so that she can be his girlfriend. Soon, Linda falls pregnant and Mickey and Linda wed. Almost immediately afterwards, bad luck arrives and Mickey loses his job at the factory due to the difficult economic situation in the 1980s. When Edward returns briefly from university over the holidays, he intends to continue as before and have a life of fun and parties with Mickey. Mickey, however, rejects Edward's suggestions as he is frustrated with his lack of employment. He pushes Edward away. When Edward sees Linda, he confesses that he has always loved her, not realising that she's already married and pregnant with Mickey's child. Mickey tries continuously to find employment, but he is rejected wherever he goes. Eventually, he is persuaded by Sammy to be a lookout for a robbery in exchange for £50. Unfortunately, the robbery goes badly wrong and Sammy shoots someone. Both brothers get arrested and Mickey is sentenced as an accessory to murder and he gets 7 years in jail. Whilst in jail, he falls into depression and is prescribed antidepressant drugs to help him cope. He quickly becomes addicted, and even though he is released early from the prison for his good behaviour, he cannot break his addiction to the pills, despite Linda's pleas. She believes that the pills are hindering Mickey from being his usual dynamic self, and she feels that Mickey is increasingly distant from her. Linda is frustrated with her marriage and Mickey's lack of attention. Edward has now become a local town councillor, and Linda gets in touch with him to help secure a new council home for herself and Mickey, and to help him find a job. However, Mickey is enraged when he finds out and pushes Linda away. She seeks solace with Edward and they begin an affair which is witnessed by Mrs. Lyons. She is quick to betray them and reveal the affair to Mickey. He is incensed and grabs Sammy's gun and confronts Edward. Mrs. Johnston and Mrs. Lyons quickly follow. The narrator tells us that the devil has finally arrived. Mickey confronts Edward with the affair and even accuses Edward of being the actual father of Linda's child. Edward empathetically denies all of this. Mrs. Johnston reveals that Mickey and Edward are actually twins, and this further enrages Mickey as he feels he could have had the privileged life of Edward. In his anger and despair, Mickey waves about his gun and accidentally kills Edward, and Mickey himself is then quickly shot down by the police. The superstition made up by Mrs. Lyons at the start of the play has now come true, and the narrator questions whether his tragedy is due to superstition or actually due to the enormous gap between the rich and the poor. So that's all you need to know about the plot for Willy Russell's Blood Brothers. I'm Miss Shaw, thanks for watching.